They didn't shout, didn't raise a single weapon. 300 Apache riders just stood there at dawn, lined across the dry earth like they had all the time in the world. And Ethan Cole knew right then this wasn't a visit. It was a reckoning. The wind moved slow through the broken fence posts, carrying dust and the faint scent of leather and smoke. And not one of those men blinked, not one shifted in the saddle. Just watched him like they were waiting for something he hadn't said yet, something he hadn't even understood. Ethan stepped off his porch, boots hitting the dirt with a hollow thud, his hand loose near his belt, but not touching the gun. Not yet, because out here a wrong move didn't just start trouble, it ended things. And he could feel it in the stillness, the kind that presses on your chest until you forget how to breathe. Then one of them moved, slow, deliberate, a rider breaking from the line. And for a second Ethan thought this was it, thought he'd hear the snap of tension turning into something worse. But the man only reached into his saddlebag and tossed something onto the ground between them. It landed soft in the dust, barely a sound. But it might as well have been thunder. Ethan's eyes dropped to it, and his throat tightened before his mind caught up. A piece of cloth, worn thin, edges torn, faded patterns he hadn't seen in years but recognized anyway. The kind of dress no settler girl would ever wear, the kind that didn't belong to his world. And there was dirt pressed deep into the fibers, and something darker that time hadn't quite erased. He didn't bend down right away, didn't dare, because the moment he touched it meant the past wasn't past anymore. It meant whatever this was had a name, and that name was his. The wind shifted again, carrying a low murmur from the horses, leather creaking, hooves grinding against hard soil, and still no one spoke. Not until she stepped forward. He didn't see her at first, not clearly, just movement. Behind the line, someone smaller than the rest, but carrying a weight none of them challenged. And when she came into the light, the sun catching in her dark hair, he felt something cold settle behind his ribs. Not fear exactly, something heavier, something that had been waiting a long time. She walked without hurry, boots silent on the dirt, eyes fixed on him in a way that didn't accuse and didn't forgive, just knew. Ethan swallowed, the taste of dust thick in his mouth, because there was something about her he couldn't place and couldn't ignore, something familiar that didn't belong to now. She stopped a few yards away, close enough that he could see the lines time had drawn across her face. Not soft, not gentle, earned lines. And around her neck, hanging against worn fabric, was a small leather cord. And at the end of it, something he hadn't seen in 15 years. His breath caught before he could stop it. The memory came like a flash of cold water, sharp and unwelcome, snow under his boots, the sound of something moving too fast in the dark, a child's voice cutting through the night, and his own hands grabbing, pulling, holding on to someone who didn't trust him yet had no choice. He pushed it back, tried to stay in the present, because whatever stood in front of him now wasn't that night, wasn't that child. The woman tilted her head just slightly, studying him the way a person studies a place they once knew but had learned to see differently. And when she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady, carrying farther than it should have in the still air. "Do you know what you took from me?" And just like that, every man behind her seemed to lean into the silence, not moving, but present in a way that filled the space. And Ethan felt the weight of that question settle on his shoulders, heavier than any rifle he'd ever carried, because he did remember the tearing fabric, the panic in her eyes, the way he thought saving her was enough. And standing there now, with 300 witnesses and one question hanging between them, he wasn't so sure anymore. The question did not move. It stayed between them like heat over desert ground, and Ethan realized something worse than anger was standing in front of him. Patience, the kind that had waited years without breaking, and he let out a slow breath, his fingers easing away from his belt because whatever this was, it was not going to be solved with iron and powder. "I pulled you out of the river," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse, the words tasting uncertain even as they left his mouth. And a ripple moved through the riders behind her, not loud, not sudden, just enough to remind him he was not alone in this moment, never had been. The woman's eyes did not change, not softer, not harder, just steady, and she took one more step forward, close enough now that he could see the faint scar along her wrist, thin and pale, like something that had healed but never truly left. And that was when it struck him, not all at once, but in pieces, The snow that night had not been the only thing cold. Her hands had been colder, trembling not from the river, but from something deeper, something he had not understood then, because he had been thinking like a man who fixes things, not a man who sees them. "You tore it," she said quietly, her gaze dropping for just a moment to the cloth in the dirt before returning to him. "My dress." And there it was, simple, plain, undeniable. And Ethan felt his chest tighten because he remembered the weight of the fabric in his grip, remembered pulling her toward the bank as the current dragged at both of them, remembered thinking that breath was all that mattered, that survival erased everything else. But standing here now, with the sun rising behind her and 300 witnesses holding their silence, he understood something he had never been taught, that some things could not be pulled apart without leaving a mark. The wind picked up slightly, brushing past them, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant water, and one of the horses shifted, hooves scraping against packed earth. But no one spoke, no one broke the line, and Ethan realized they were waiting for him, not for an apology, not for an excuse, but for something else, something he had not yet found. "I was trying to keep you alive," he said, quieter this time. Not as a defense, not as a claim, just the truth as he knew it, and for the first time, something changed in her expression, not enough for most men to notice, but enough for him. A small shift in the way her shoulders settled, like a weight adjusting rather than lifting. She reached up. Slowly, her fingers brushing the leather cord at her neck, and when she pulled it forward, the object hanging there caught the light. A small piece of worn metal wrapped in leather, familiar in a way that made his breath catch again, because he had seen it before, in his own hands, cold and slick with river water, before he tied it back around the neck of a child who had not trusted him but had no other choice. "You gave this back to me," she said, holding it between them, not offering it, not taking it away, just letting it exist in that space. "After." And she did not finish the sentence, did not need to, because the rest of it was written in the silence around them, in the men who had come with her, in the years that had passed without him knowing what had become of the girl he carried through the dark. Ethan's eyes moved from the pendant to her face, searching for something he could name, something he could hold on to. But all he found was certainty, not the kind that demands, but the kind that remembers. "Then why are you here?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it, because nothing about this made sense to the man he had been, the man who believed a single act ended where it ended. Behind her, the line of riders remained still, but the air shifted, a tension not of threat but of expectation, like the moment before a storm breaks or a truth is spoken that cannot be taken back. And she let the pendant fall back against her chest before answering, her voice low, carrying only as far as it needed to. "Because you think that night ended there," she said, and for the first time, there was something in her tone that cut deeper than any blade, not anger, not blame, but clarity. But it did not. And Ethan felt something in his chest give way, not fear, not yet, but the beginning of understanding that whatever he had taken, whatever he had given, had not been his to measure, and whatever stood in front of him now had come not for revenge, but for something far more difficult to face. The words settled slow, like dust after a long ride, and Ethan felt them more than he understood them, because he had always believed that night ended with the river behind him and the road ahead, a clean line between before and after, but she was standing there telling him that line had never been real. He shifted his weight slightly, boots pressing into the dry ground, and glanced once at the cloth still lying between them, the torn edge catching the morning light, and it no longer looked like an accident. It looked like a beginning he had walked away from without knowing. "Then what did it start?" he asked, not looking at her at first, his eyes tracing the fence line, the broken posts, the land that had been quiet for so long it forgot how to answer questions. And when he finally looked back, she was watching him the same way she had before, like she could see the distance between who he was and who he thought he was. She did not answer right away, and that silence stretched, filled only by the low shift of horses and the wind brushing through the valley, until she turned slightly, just enough that the line of riders behind her came into clearer view, not threatening, not restless, just present, and Ethan realized they were not here for him alone. They were here for what he represented, for what had happened long before this morning. "When I returned," she said, her voice steady, "they did not believe me. and she nodded back toward the riders, not accusing, not blaming, just stating what had been. They saw the torn cloth, they saw the marks, and they believed a story that was easier than the truth. And Ethan felt something tighten in his chest because he knew that kind of story had lived around it his whole life, the kind that fills in what is missing with what is feared. "And you let them come here?" he asked, a hint of disbelief slipping through despite himself, because standing in front of 300 men who might have believed the wrong thing was not a position anyone chose lightly. And she shook her head once, small, certain. "I let time speak first," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that carried weight, not regret, not anger, just patience worn into something strong. Ethan frowned slightly, trying to follow, but she was already moving again. One slow step to the side, clearing the space between them, and for the first time he saw beyond her, past the line of riders, where the land dipped slightly toward the old trail that led down to the dry creek bed, and there, tied to one of the lead horses, was something wrapped in cloth, long, narrow, and handled with care. His eyes lingered on it without meaning to, and she noticed, of course she noticed, because she seemed to notice everything he did not say. "You think they came because of what you took," she said, her gaze steady on him. "But they came because of what you gave." And the words landed different, not heavy like accusation, but sharp like a truth that does not wait for permission. Ethan blinked once, slow, because that did not fit, did not match the story forming in his head, and for a moment he almost laughed, not from humor but from the strain of trying to hold two ideas that refused to sit together. "I gave you a way out of that river," he said, and even as he said it, it sounded smaller than it had ever felt before. She studied him for a long second, then reached down and picked up the torn cloth from the ground, brushing the dust from it with careful hands, not like something broken, but like something remembered, and she held it up just enough for him to see it clearly, the tear, the wear, the history written into every thread. "You gave me a choice," she said quietly, "and that is not the same thing." And the wind shifted again, stronger this time, pulling at the edges of her clothing, carrying her words past him and into the waiting line behind, and Ethan felt the ground beneath him settle into something unfamiliar, because he had never thought of that night as a beginning, never considered that saving someone did not end when they could stand again, that it might follow them, shape them, return one day standing in front of him with 300 witnesses and a question he was only just beginning to understand. He looked past her, again, toward the wrapped object on the horse, then back to her, and something in his voice changed when he spoke next, not defensive, not certain, just searching. "What did you bring back with you?" And this time, when she answered, there was no delay at all, just a quiet certainty that carried further than any shout ever could. "The truth you could not see then," she said, and the riders behind her did not move, but the air between them shifted once more, like something long held was about to be placed where it belonged. "The truth you could not see then did not arrive with noise or force. It arrived the way the morning had, slow and certain, and Ethan felt it before he understood it, felt it in the way the riders behind her did not shift or speak, in the way the wind seemed to move around them instead of through them, as if even the land knew something was about to be set right. Ayanna turned her head slightly, not enough to break her focus on him, but enough to signal without words, and one of the riders near the front moved at last, guiding his horse forward with careful hands, not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate, and Ethan watched as the wrapped object he had noticed before was brought closer, the cloth around it worn but clean, tied with a strip of leather that had been handled many times. The rider stopped a few feet behind Ayanna and waited, and she reached back without looking, taking the bundle into her hands with a familiarity that spoke of more than just possession. It spoke of memory. She held it there for a moment, not opening it yet, letting its weight settle between them, and Ethan found himself staring at it without meaning to, because something about it felt heavier than it should have been, not in pounds but in meaning, like it carried more than what could be seen. "You walked away that night," she said quietly, her eyes never leaving his, and there was no accusation in it, only fact, the kind that does not need to be sharpened to cut, and Ethan felt his jaw tighten, slightly because he had walked away, because he had believed that was the end of what he owed, the end of what he could do. "I thought you were safe," he said, and it sounded smaller now than it ever had before, like a man explaining something he no longer fully believed. Ayana nodded once, slow, as if acknowledging the truth of his words without agreeing to their meaning. And then she began to untie the leather strip around the bundle, her fingers steady, practiced, and the sound of the knot loosening seemed louder than it should have been in the still air. The cloth fell back in layers, revealing what had been hidden, and Ethan leaned forward slightly without realizing it, his breath catching again as the shape beneath came into view. It was not gold, not anything that would buy land or power in the world he knew. It was something simpler, something older, a small carved piece of wood, worn smooth by time and touch, shaped into the form of a wolf, its lines soft but unmistakable. And for a moment Ethan did not understand why that would be brought here, why that would matter. Then the memory returned, clearer this time. The way the child had clutched something to her chest even as he carried her. The way he had almost taken it from her thinking it was nothing, and the way she had held on to it with a strength that surprised him. Even then, "This was mine," Ayana said, holding the carving out just enough for him to see it clearly, before that night. And then she turned it slightly, and Ethan saw something else, something he had not expected, a thin strip of cloth tied carefully around the base of the carving, a strip that matched the torn fabric still in her other hand. And suddenly the two pieces became one in his mind, not separate, not broken, but connected. "And this," she continued, lifting the torn cloth slightly, "is what they saw." And she did not need to explain further, because he understood now, understood how the story had been told without him there, how the evidence had spoken in his place, how silence had filled in the rest. He exhaled slowly, the weight of it settling into him, because he could see it now, could see how what he thought was a rescue could have been seen as something else entirely, something that required an answer, and for years he had not been there to give one. "So you brought them here to hear it from me," he said, the realization forming as he spoke, and for the first time there was a hint of something like understanding in his voice. Not complete, not settled, but closer than before. Ayana watched him for a long moment, then shook her head once, gentle but certain, and lowered both the carving and the cloth slightly, not hiding them, just easing their weight between them. "No," she said, her voice softer now, but no less steady. "I brought them here so they could see what I chose." And that word lingered, chosen, deliberate, something that belonged to her and not to him or the past. And Ethan felt something shift inside him. Again, something deeper than guilt or relief, something that did not have a name yet, only direction. Behind her, the riders remained still, but the silence had changed, no longer waiting, no longer holding. It had become something else, something that listened, and Ethan realized this was not about proving what had happened, it was about showing what it had meant. And as he stood there, looking at the carving, the cloth, and the woman who carried both without anger or apology, he understood that whatever came next would not be decided by the past alone, but by what they did with it now. The word chosen did not fade when she said it. It stayed there, settled between them like something placed with care, and Ethan found himself looking at the carving again, then at the strip of cloth, then back at her, as if the meaning might shift depending on where he placed his eyes. But it did not. It only grew clearer, heavier, more complete. He drew in a slow breath, the dry air filling his lungs. And for the first time since the riders appeared, he felt something other than pressure. Something close to understanding, though it came with its own weight. "You chose to remember it differently," he said, not as a challenge, not as doubt, but as a man trying to follow a path he had not seen before. And Ayana gave a small nod, the kind that did not seek agreement, only recognition. "I chose to see all of it," she replied, her voice steady, and she lowered the carving slightly, letting it rest in her palm as if it belonged there, as if it always had. Not just what was taken, but what was given in the same breath. And the wind moved again, softer now, brushing past them like a quiet witness. Ethan's gaze drifted past her for a moment, over the line of riders, over the land that stretched beyond them, and he realized how small his world had been, how narrow the way he measured things, one action, one outcome, one ending, clean and contained. But nothing standing in front of him now was clean or contained. It was layered, carried forward, returned. "In them," he said, nodding slightly toward the riders. They did not see it that way, and there was no accusation in his voice, only a simple truth he had lived around for years: how people fill silence with certainty. Ayanna followed his glance back to her people, her expression unchanged, but her eyes softer now, not toward him, but toward them, and for a moment she did not speak, as if giving space for the weight of that question to settle where it needed to. They saw what the world has always shown them, she said finally, a story that protects them from what they do not understand. And she looked back at him, holding his gaze. And I could not change that with words. And Ethan felt that land somewhere deep, because he knew that truth too, knew how little words could do once a story took root. So you brought them here, he said again. But this time it was not a question, it was a recognition of something larger than either of them, and she inclined her head slightly, accepting that. I brought them to see, she said, and then she did something that shifted the air once more. She stepped back, just one step, creating space between them, not distance, but room, and then she turned, not fully, just enough to face the riders behind her. The movement was small, but it carried through the line like a ripple across still water, and for the first time since they had arrived, the formation changed, not breaking, not dissolving, but opening slightly, making way for what came next. One of the older men, his hair marked with gray and his posture steady with years, guided his horse forward, stopping a few feet behind her, his eyes moving from Ethan to the objects in her hands, then back again, measuring, weighing, and Ethan felt that gaze settle on him without hostility, without warmth, just presence. Ayanna lifted the carving and the cloth together, holding them, where both men could see, and for a moment no one spoke, the silence stretching long enough that Ethan became aware of his own heartbeat, steady, grounding. Then she spoke, not loudly, not for the land or the sky, but for the people who had come with her. This is what happened, she said, her voice carrying clear in the still morning, and Ethan realized she was not telling a story, she was showing one, letting the objects speak where words would fail. The older man's eyes lingered on the cloth, then on the carving, then finally on Ethan, and in that look there was something that had not been there before, not acceptance, not yet, but consideration, the kind that does not come easily and does not leave quickly. Ethan stood where he was, not moving, not reaching for anything, because he understood now that this moment was not his to control, not his to shape. It was something he had stepped into without knowing years ago, and now it had returned, asking him not to defend it, not to explain it, but simply to stand inside it without turning away. The wind eased again, the dust settling slowly around their boots, and for the first time since dawn, the silence no longer felt like a judgment waiting to fall. It felt like something waiting to be understood, and as Ethan met the older man's gaze, then looked back to Ayanna, he realized that whatever came next would not be decided by force or fear, but by whether the truth she carried could take root in a place where it had never been allowed to grow. The older man did not speak right away, and that silence carried more weight than any quick judgment ever could, his eyes moving once more between the cloth and the carving before settling on Ethan, not searching for guilt anymore, but something else, something quieter, something that had to be chosen the same way Ayanna had chosen it. Ethan stood still under that gaze, shoulders squared but not tense, his hands empty at his sides, because he understood now that nothing he could hold would matter here, not a weapon, not a word, only the way he remained. The wind shifted across the open land, stirring loose dust along the ground, brushing against boots and hooves alike, and in that moment it felt like the entire valley was holding its breath, waiting for something that had been set in motion long before any of them stood here. The older man finally drew a slow breath, his posture steady as he guided his horse one step closer, the leather creaking softly. And when he spoke, his voice was low, measured, carrying the weight of years lived and decisions made carefully. You left, he said, not as accusation, not even as a question, just a fact placed gently between them, and Ethan nodded. Once, because there was no use in shaping that into anything else. I thought it was done. Ethan answered, his voice even, and for the first time there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to defend or explain beyond what was true, and the older man studied him for a long second, as if measuring not the words, but the space behind them. Ayana remained still between them, not intervening, not guiding, allowing the moment to belong to both men, and Ethan realized that was part of her choice too. Not to speak for him, not to speak over them, but to let what had been hidden find its own voice. The older man's gaze shifted briefly to Ayana, then back to Ethan, and something in his expression changed, not softened, not hardened, simply adjusted, like a piece of a larger picture finally settling into place. "And yet she stands here," he said, and there was something in that statement that carried more than simple observation. It carried recognition of what had endured, what had returned, what had been carried forward without him. Ethan followed that line of thought without speaking, his eyes moving to Ayana, to the way she held the carving and the cloth together, not separating them, not favoring one over the other. And for the first time he understood that what she had brought back was not proof, not defense, but balance. The riders behind them remained still, but the silence had changed again, no longer heavy, no longer waiting. Now it felt like listening, like something was being considered beyond a single moment. The older man reached out slowly, not toward Ethan, but toward the carving in Ayana's hand, and she allowed it, placing it gently into his palm, and the way he held it spoke of respect, not just for the object, but for what it represented. He turned it once, studying the worn edges, the strip of cloth tied at its base, and then he looked back at Ethan, and this time there was something clearer in his gaze, not judgment, not yet acceptance, but understanding beginning to take shape. "You did not know," he said, and it was not a question, it was an acknowledgement, one that did not erase what had happened, but placed it in its proper place. And Ethan felt that land differently than anything else that had been said so far, because it did not free him, it did not condemn him, it simply named the truth as it had been. "No," Ethan replied, just as steady, because anything more would have been less honest, and the older man gave a small nod, the kind that closed one door while opening another. He handed the carving back to Ayana, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, not of the past, but of what came after. "Then what matters is what is known now." And the words settled across the space between them, not as a command, not as a verdict, but as a direction. Ayana stepped forward again, just enough to stand beside the older man rather than between them, and Ethan saw it clearly then, the shift from conflict to something else, something quieter, something harder, the work of deciding what to do with a truth once it had been seen. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying with it the faint sound of distant water somewhere beyond the ridge, and Ethan realized that the question was no longer what had happened that night, but what would happen here, in the open, with nothing left hidden. And as he met their gaze without turning away, he understood that whatever came next would not be forced upon him. It would be something he chose, just as she had, and that choice would carry forward long after this morning faded into memory. The words "what is known now" did not settle easily. They moved through Ethan like a slow current, shifting things he had left untouched for years, and he realized that knowing was not the same as understanding, and understanding was not the same as choosing. He drew a breath and let it out steady, his eyes moving once more across the line of riders. Not as a threat now, but as something else entirely, a presence that had come not to take, but to witness what would follow, then say it. Ethan said quietly, not to challenge, not to demand, but because silence had carried them this far, and now something needed to be placed into the open, something that belonged to all of them. The older man did not answer, not yet, his gaze shifting instead to Ayana, and in that look there was a question without words, a permission that only she could give, because whatever came next had begun with her long before it reached this place. Ayana stood still for a moment, the carving resting in her hand, the torn cloth draped across her fingers, and Ethan could see it in the way she held them, not as evidence, not as memory alone, but as something she had carried until it was ready to be set down. Then she stepped forward again, closing the space between her and Ethan until only a few feet remained, close enough that the years between them felt thinner, closer, almost within reach. "You think this is about what you did," she said, her voice low, clear, carrying just enough to reach every ear without rising above the quiet. "But it is about what I became after." And the words shifted the ground beneath Ethan more than anything else that had been said, because he had not thought about that. not once in all the years since that night. Had not considered that what came after belonged to her in a way that had nothing to do with him, and yet everything to do with what he had done. She lifted the carving slightly, just enough for him to see it again, the worn edges, the strip of cloth tied at its base. And for a moment it seemed less like an object and more like a bridge between two moments that had never truly separated. They wanted a story, she continued, her eyes steady on his. One that made sense of what they saw, one that protected what they feared losing. And her gaze flickered briefly toward the riders behind her, before returning. But I would not let that be the only story told. And Ethan felt that settle deep, because he understood now that this had never been about clearing his name. It had been about claiming hers. The older man shifted slightly in his saddle, not interrupting, not directing, but listening in a way that carried weight, and the riders behind him remained still, the silence now full not of tension, but of attention. So I waited, Iana said, and there was something in those words that carried time within them, years measured not in days but in understanding, until I could stand here and show them what I chose to carry forward. And she let the carving lower. Again, resting against her palm, the cloth brushing lightly against it, no longer torn apart, but held together. Ethan swallowed slowly, his throat dry, because he could feel the shape of what she was saying, could see it forming in front of him, and it was not something he could answer with words alone. "And what is that?" he asked, not because he did not see it, but because he needed to hear it, needed to place it into the open the same way she had. Iana held his gaze for a long moment, long enough that the wind seemed to pause again, long enough that even the horses stilled, and when she spoke, her voice carried something deeper than before, something that did not ask to be accepted, only recognized. "That night did not take anything from me," she said, and the words landed quiet but firm, reshaping everything that had stood before them. "It gave me a reason to return." And for a moment nothing moved, nothing shifted, because the meaning of that did not rush, it unfolded, slow and steady, filling the space between them until there was no room left for the old story to stand alone. Ethan felt it then, not as relief, not as forgiveness, but as something heavier and more lasting, a responsibility that did not come from blame, but from being part of something that had continued long after he had walked away. The older man drew in a slow breath, his gaze moving once more between them, and then out across the land, as if measuring what had been said against something larger than any one of them. And when he looked back, there was no trace of the question that had brought them here, only the quiet weight of a decision already forming. Behind them, the riders did not move, but the silence had changed again, no longer holding anything back. Now it carried forward, and Ethan realized that whatever came next would not be about proving or defending. It would be about whether he was willing to stand inside the truth she had brought back, not as the man he had been, but as the one he chose to be now. The words "it gave me a reason to return" did not end the moment. They opened it, and Ethan felt that more than anything that had come before, because there was no place to stand outside of it anymore, no distance left to keep, only a choice that had been waiting long before he understood it. He let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing not from relief, but from acceptance, and his eyes moved from Iana to the older man, then across the riders behind them, each face steady, each presence quiet. And he realized they were not here to decide for him. They were here to see what he would do with what had been given back. The land stretched around them, dry and open, the fence posts leaning where time had worn them down, the small cabin behind him holding years of silence. And for the first time, it did not feel like shelter, it felt like something unfinished. Ethan took a step forward, slow, deliberate, closing the space between him and Iana, not out of defiance, not out of urgency, but because standing still no longer made sense. And when he stopped, he did not reach for the carving, did not reach for the cloth. He simply stood there, looking at her the way he should have looked that night, not as someone to fix, but as someone to understand. "I cannot change what I did not know," he said quietly, his voice steady, carrying just enough to be heard without breaking the stillness. "But I can choose what I do with it now." And the words did not sound like a defense, they sounded like a line drawn forward, something that did not erase the past, but refused to let it remain unfinished. Iana watched him without moving, her expression unreadable for a moment. And then something shifted, not a smile, not relief, just a small easing in the way she held herself, like a weight she had carried had finally found a place to rest. She stepped closer, closing the last distance between them, and for a moment the world around them seemed to fall quiet in a different way, not waiting, not holding, but listening to something that did not need to be spoken loudly. She reached out, not quickly, not hesitantly, and placed the carving into his hand, the wood warm from her touch, worn smooth from years of being carried. And Ethan felt it settle into his palm like something that had been waiting there all along, not as a gift, not as a debt, but as a reminder of a moment that had never truly ended. Then stand with it, she said softly, and there was no demand in her voice, only truth, the kind that does not need to be forced. Ethan closed his fingers around the carving slowly, feeling the shape of it, the weight of it, and for a moment he said nothing, because anything he could say would fall short of what it meant. The older man watched this exchange in silence, his gaze steady, and then he gave a single, small nod. Not to Ethan alone, but to both of them, to what had been brought forward and what had been accepted. Behind them, the line of riders shifted for the first time, not out of tension, but out of release, a subtle movement of reins, a quiet adjustment of posture, as if something that had been held for years had finally been set down. The wind moved across the land again, carrying with it the faint sound of distant water and the low rustle of grass, and the morning light had fully broken now, stretching long across the ground, touching everything without favor. Iana stepped back slightly, not creating distance, but allowing space, and her eyes moved once more across the riders, then back to Ethan, and there was something different there now, not a question, not a test, but recognition. Ethan stood where he was, the carving in his hand, the past no longer something behind him, but something he held, something he chose not to set aside again. And as he looked out across the land, then back at the people who had come to witness this moment, he understood that this was not an ending. It was a beginning that had taken years to arrive, and whatever came next would not be written in silence, but in the way he stood from this moment forward. The morning did not end with a shout or a gesture. It ended the way it had begun, quiet, steady, as if the land itself had decided that nothing more needed to be said, and Ethan stood there with the small wooden carving in his hand, feeling its worn edges press into his palm, not heavy, not light, just present, the way truth settles when it no longer needs to prove itself. The riders began to turn one by one, not in haste, not in retreat, but in a kind of calm that comes after something has been understood, their horses shifting with soft movements, leather creaking, hooves pressing into the dry earth, and the long line that had once felt like a wall slowly became a path leading away. The older man was the last to move, his gaze resting on Ethan for a moment longer, not measuring, not questioning, simply acknowledging what had been seen, and then he gave a final nod, small but certain, before guiding his horse to follow the others, leaving behind nothing but tracks that would fade with the wind. Iana remained where she was, standing a few feet from Ethan, the space between them no longer filled with tension, but with something quieter, something that did not need to be named to be understood. She looked out across the land for a moment, her eyes tracing the horizon as if marking something only she could see, and then she turned back to him, and there was a softness there now, not fragile, not uncertain, just real. "I told them I would return," she said, her voice low, carrying only to him, and Ethan nodded slightly, because now he understood that the promise had never been about bringing people or proving a point. It had been about completing something that had been left open for too long. He glanced down at the carving in his hand, then back at her, and for a moment he searched for something to say, something that could match what had just passed between them, but the words did not come, and he realized they did not need to. Iana stepped back once, then another step, not turning away yet, and in that movement there was no distance, only direction, the kind that comes when a path has been chosen and there is no need to look back for approval. "You stood with it," she said, and there was a quiet finality in those words, not as an ending, but as a recognition of something that had taken shape in the space between them, something that would not fade with the dust or the passing of time. Ethan gave a small nod, his fingers tightening slightly around the carving, not to hold on, but to feel it. to remember it in a way that would not be forgotten again, and he watched as she turned at last, walking back toward the trail where the riders had gone, her steps steady, unhurried, each one carrying her further into a future that had been shaped long before this morning. The wind moved again, lifting the edges of her clothing, carrying with it the faint sound of hooves already growing distant, and for a moment Ethan stood alone in the wide, open silence that returned as naturally as it had been broken. But it was not the same silence as before. It did not press against him or close him in. It stretched outward, leaving room for something new, something that had not existed on this land until now. He turned slowly, his gaze moving across the worn fence, the small cabin, the ground that had held him for so many years, and for the first time he saw it not as a place to remain untouched, but as a place that could change without losing what it was. The carving rested in his hand, warm now, shaped by time and by the choice he had made to accept it, and he understood that it was not a token, not a debt repaid, but a reminder that some moments do not end when they pass. They continue, waiting for the day they are faced fully. Ethan stepped forward, not toward the trail she had taken, but toward the work that lay ahead, the small things that would carry this truth into the days that followed. And as the sun rose higher, casting light across the land, there was no need for words to mark what had happened, because out here, in a place where silence speaks louder than anything else, the only thing that mattered was the way a man chose to stand once he finally understood.